Hi everyone, this is Ali. I will be talking about this week's readings on Middle East queer studies. I just tried to bring all readings together under some sub-themes. Also, I will share examples and try to pose some questions that I thought would help us to unpack readings together. So the first point I would like to highlight is the discussions over the object of queer study. As we see in earlier weeks, theorists that we read this week argue that queer theory must go beyond sexuality and include the complexity of religious, regional, class, national, and political variances. They urge us to think the queer studies and area studies in the Middle East without omitting the situated history of encounter with the Western gaze, as we read this before in Poir's Queer Times, Queer Assemblies. Borrowing from Miktashi and Poir, I think one of the imperialism manifestations is permanent war in the Middle East. By war, I do not solely refer to a state of armed conflict. I also refer to social, economic, and epistemic forms of violence imposed on the Middle East. So, queer studies associated with the so called Middle East need to consider these facts determining and shaping the burden of daily life to a great extent in this geography. I use the expression so called Middle East on purpose because I understand that the term Middle East is defined by geopolitical strategists who reside outside this region. With the words of Professor Shaksari, Middle East is an arbitrary colonial designation which includes Southwest Asia and North Africa. Turkey, for example, where I'm from, is particularly interesting here because even though Turkey's only 10% of the landmass is in continental Europe, its status is often described as a European state rather than Middle Eastern. Because formally speaking, Turkey is currently allied with or supported by the United States strategically in this geography. So it's frankly geopolitics deciding to what extent you are a Middle Eastern or European or Western. So Turkey is sometimes in between, for example. This week's readings help us to revisit the question of what queer theory may look like when it's considered outside Euro American histories, sexualities, relations, locations, languages, or bodies. The authors we read this week put the Middle East and queer studies into a dialogue and discuss what they can learn from each other. They critically extend the meaning and content of queer theory and area studies, suggesting, with the words of Poir and Mikdashi, queer theory itself remains unmarked and unencumbered by location. So, what we can discuss this week is the universalization of queer theory and queer solidarity, and we are familiar with those concepts from earlier weeks. And I just want to start with the theory part. So, this week's reading raised a criticism of the US and Eurocentric queer scholarship as a hegemonic epistemic formation. They question how the Middle East has been depicted, studied, and represented by the mainstream queer theory with its area studies implications. In this regard, one of the highlighted notions is Edward Said's Orientalism in a way that speaks to the normalization and exotization of the Orient other, Eastern other in the Middle East. I understand that the material and corporeal realities, including queer sexual practices, lifestyles, bodies, and languages in the Middle East, are deemed uncivilized, outdated, and discouraged by the Western framework. For instance, for Paul Amar and Al Shakri, Middle East studies had fought to disassociate itself from Orientalism since the 1980s. Then they became targeted by a wave of attempts to purge the field of critical politics. Omar and al Shakri reflect that the rising field of queer studies found itself facing pressures to appropriate by a global LGBT movement assimilated into a new civilizing mission through its embrace of pro-marriage and pro-military politics. So we know this tension again from the earlier weeks. The authors also critically, like this week, discuss Western language again in the queer theory that integrates cultural and area-specific events and realities into one unified, purified, universal story. For example, Puar and Miktashi find homophobia as a homogenizing and flattening discourse. They tell us the ways in which homophobia as a term is understood and circulated with its gendered, racial, or economic attachments in Beirut, Lebanon. In the article Reluctant Queer, in turning Rao's piece of the locations of homophobia, Sabia Alucci offers us to complicate our analysis of homophobia by turning it into inwardly. Alucia says that she maintains the bearing of the sex colonial legacies on contemporary sexuality discourses, including homophobia across the Middle Eastern North African region. She agrees with Rao on the importance of turning our analytic gaze inwardly to account for the agency of local actors in sustaining homophobic narratives and practices. In turn, LGBTQ activists in these so-called third world areas struggle both with homophobia within their communities and ethnocentrism and essentialism that international or white LGBTQ allies continuously reproduce. In the opening chapter of Queering Palestine, the authors argue the term and practice of coming out in a similar vein with homophobia. They say Palestinian queers reject the universalization of coming out and insistence on public displays of sexual diversity as interesting to queer activism. For them, this Western model of coming out denies Palestinians all context and tools. I would agree with this actually. Let me give you an example. So the murder of 26-year-old physics student Ahmet Yıldız in July 2008 was the first case mainstream in the public eye, and it was dubbed as the first gay honor killing in Turkey. Gay honor killing. As the main suspect for the murder, Ahmet's biological father remains runaway. The trial drags on for years with no justice. I found myself, reading these articles, I found myself thinking about whether the expression of gay honor killing is incommensurable with the generalized term of homophobia. So as we see in this and the Beirut example, these languages seem to have different subject matter and also context matter. At this point, my question would be, do you think, for example, where there is a way of forming a universal queer academic and political language, do we need it in the first place? What does this discussion remind us about the politics of translation that we discuss, that we continuously revisit in previous weeks? I remember, for example, the viral song and dance protest created by Chilean feminist collective Las Tesis. Feminists in different parts of the world had translated the song into their native language by making small changes and danced in the public squares. For example, in Turkey, the women had faced police violence while performing these protests on the streets. So it matters, I guess, where the language alongside its form is created and in what sense it's traveled, around the world. Around the world and around the text, actually. So this is the theory part. Now I want to move from the allegedly universal queer theorizations to the universalization claims of queer solidarity or rights-based discourse at large. So, for instance, in turning the Massad's arguments on sexuality as a Western imperial category that we are familiar with from earlier weeks, Paul Omar and Al-Shakri point out that the imposition, essentialization, and local appropriation of the homo-heterosexuality binary is attended with the universalization of a human rights-based discourse that links sexual rights to civilizational worth. Mikdashi and Poir also discuss this transnational LGBTQ rights discourse, suggesting that it's anchored in white, cisgendered, masculinist, and middle-class queer histories elevated through the omission of race, sex, and class domination in the United States. As such, for Poir and Mikdashi, facing located and ongoing histories of power, domination, would be a precondition of the global LGBTQ movement, of course, if such mobilization will ever exist. So I have a general understanding from the readings that the international community operating in the Middle East engaged with the empire in the guise of human rights and the promise of queer liberation. It seems the international community's physical or material existence in this region is possible insofar they sustain human rights as a Euro-American progressive liberal category that becomes universalized through the empire. We remember this discussion also from Joseph Massad. In their piece, Professor Shakzari also problematizes this universal human rights rhetoric concerning refugee regimes and queer kinships. For Shakzari, queer refugee rights discourses are contingent on geopolitics. They narrate the so-called Western progressive time of rights that promise queer refugees emancipation from repression in the Middle East. However, this temporality comes to a halt in processing zones such as Turkey. Queer, transgender, and refugee persons find themselves amid tremendous bureaucratic work. They have to repeat temporarily fixed notions of sexual identity and retell their suffering or violent experiences to be recognized as authentic, as true by international human rights regimes. According to Shakzari, these notions only become intelligible within a double move of distancing from a miserable homophobic past and approaching a feature of freedom through private rescuer sponsorship programs. Through such projects, a global queer community, or more specifically, first world queers, adopt queer refugees from Middle East as their kin. So we see that this promise of virtual kinship and a better future elites the power relations and the role of human security state, NGOs, and the neo-colonial and neoliberal technologies of subjectivation that produce refugees and their make lives disposable in the first place. So I can relate to the piece of Shakzari as someone living in that transition country, Turkey. First, for me, the politics of miseration reminds me of the newspaper headlines such as, "Is Istanbul a heaven for LGBTQ Syrian refugees?" So as a metropolitan and relatively European area, Istanbul was celebrated and it is still being celebrated as progressive for refugees in misery that seek to go to Europe. So in this case, countries such as Syria, Iran, Afghanistan are described as places where evil and suffering prevail. This hierarchy somehow speaks to Poir's concept of homonationalism in global politics that Sabia Alucci also reminds us. Under such international politics, homonational politics, certain states are reproduced as rough and underdeveloped, whereas others are treated as enlightened and developed and more liberal. So of course these classifications seem temporary and their boundaries are slippery through the geopolitics. Second, the vast claim of the progressive time of rights within the refugee regimes is absolutely fiction. Sarah Hegazi, a prominent LGBTQ activist who sought asylum in Canada after being arrested and tortured in native country Egypt, died by suicide in Toronto in June 2020. In an interview, Sarah Hegazi described the life in Canada marked not by relief or a sense of sanctuary, but of nightmares, depression, and panic attacks. She said, "Home is not land and borders. It's about the people you love. Here in Canada, I have not any people. I have not any family. I don't have any friends. So I'm not happy here." So she left behind, before the suicide, she left behind a note handwritten in Arabic. "To my friends, the experience, the journey of being refugee was harsh and I'm too weak to resist it. Forgive me," she wrote in that note. So the harrowing journey, the difficult journey she described proves that refugees produced under the refugee regimes are subjected to continuous debellation, debellation à la poire, and slow death à la Berland in the name of rights. Slow death is a way of living in the current stage of capitalism and the empire in the Middle East. So given this, I want to share a question visiting my mind these days. Is there another way to envision geopolitics, basically? I'm not much trained or educated in Marxism, but I'm still thinking about what Marxist geopolitics with its criticism of capitalism and empire would look like. So this would be a question that I pose for this week. So apart from these, the universalization of queer theory and queer solidarity, rights-based discourse, and everything. As the last point, I would like to attract your attention to the affective turn and references in this week's readings. As we see in the chapter Curiosities of Middle East Studies in Queer Times, the Middle East is full with gender troubles, sectarian subversions, social movements, and affective economies, and the Middle East scholars need to consider this while generating a new theory. Euro-American scholars shouldn't take people and their stories in the Middle East as merely research data. Professor Shakhsari also argues the affective politics with the production and deployment of the discourse miseration and victimhood in refugee regimes. Instead of utilizing such politics, Shakhsari suggests us to look at Dreams of Trespass by Fatima Mernissi as an example to challenge the epistemological and affective groundings that canonize Euro-American scholarship and curricula, which renders these texts impossible to read and teach. Fatima Mernissi's I hope my pronunciation is right, Mernissi's narrative of the harem as a space of alliances that transpasses heteronormative forms of the nuclear family, even as they sustain hegemonic articulations of family, status, desire, and citizenship, is worth discussing in the context of queer theory's relation with normativity and anti-normativity that we visit in earlier weeks. Dreams of Trespass reminds me of Tadier's concept of the remainder life, in which the possibility of queer and alternative life survival comes to be in Filipino refugees' stories of reproductive labor. So we can discuss the remainder life with this Dreams of Trespass, with the stories of harem, basically. And I believe we can also discuss Reluctant Queer that Sabia Alucci argues in a way that reluctant queers must navigate an array of homophobic locations and between local, native, and global forces of power. I think such an itinerary navigation brings out the question of the politics and economics of affect as well. So this is basically what I got for this week. I hope you enjoyed listening. See you on discussion forum.